Close your eyes for a moment and imagine stepping into a kitchen in 1955. The floor is covered in cheerful linoleum squares, the kind that never quite matches the curtains but somehow makes the whole room feel alive. A radio hums softly from the counter, maybe tuned to Perry Como or Nat King Cole, while the smell of fresh biscuits drifts out of the oven. The kitchen isn't just a place to cook, it's the beating heart of the home. Kids lean on the table, pencils scratching at homework, while mom hums a tune and stirs a pot, stretching a single chicken into not one meal, but three. Back then, thrift wasn't just a clever lifestyle trend. It was survival, tradition, and a quiet kind of pride. Every scrap of bread had a second life as pudding. Every leftover bone simmered into soup. Food was never wasted, because food was love. And somehow, those simple, budget-friendly meals didn't feel like sacrifices. They felt like comfort. They felt like family. The 1950s were an era of ingenuity in the kitchen. Grocery budgets were tight, families were large, and yet dinner was somehow always ready at 6 o'clock sharp. Casseroles stretched ingredients like magic. Tins of Spam and tuna became heroes, and vegetables from backyard gardens found their way into hearty dishes that warmed both body and soul. It wasn't fancy cooking, but it had something better. It had heart. And here's the thing, those thrifty recipes, born out of necessity, still have something to teach us today. In a world where groceries seem to cost more every week, we can look back to the kitchens of the 1950s for inspiration. Not just to save a few dollars, but to rediscover that comforting feeling of making the most with what we have. So, in this video, we're going to revisit 25 thrifty recipes from the 1950s, meals that stretched, satisfied, and saved money back then and could still do the same today. Some will bring back warm memories, others may surprise you, but together, they'll remind us that the kitchen has always been a place where thrift and creativity come together, served with a side of love. Magic meatloaf. Picture this, it's a Thursday night in 1957, and the smell of meatloaf is filling the house. Not steak, not roast beef, those were for special occasions, but a humble loaf made of ground beef stretched with breadcrumbs, eggs, and onion. Mom would pat it carefully into shape, maybe drizzling ketchup across the top in a zigzag pattern before sliding it into the oven. As it baked, the edges browned and crisped, filling the whole kitchen with a savory aroma that made you impatient for supper. The magic wasn't just in the taste, it was in the thrift. A single pound of beef, which might have cost around 30 to 40 cents back then, could feed a whole family when mixed with fillers like oatmeal or day-old bread. Add a side of mashed potatoes and maybe some canned peas, and suddenly dinner felt complete. But meatloaf had another hidden superpower, the leftovers. Thick slices in the fridge were destined for sandwiches the next day, tucked between two pieces of white bread with a little mustard. Somehow, the flavors seemed even better cold. Meatloaf wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable. It was the kind of meal that said, "We'll be okay. We can stretch what we have." And when you cut into it, revealing the steaming center, there was always that cozy feeling that thrift didn't mean going without. It meant making the most with what you had, and enjoying every bite. Chipped beef on toast. Now, if you grew up in the 1950s, chances are you remember a dish that was equal parts practical and, well, polarizing. Chipped beef on toast. Some folks lovingly called it creamed chipped beef, while others, especially veterans fresh from the service, had a less flattering nickname for it, SOS, or stuff on a shingle. This dish started with little more than a jar of dried, salted beef. The meat was sliced into thin ribbons and stirred into a creamy white gravy made from butter, flour, and milk. Then the whole mixture was ladled generously over crisp toast. Simple? Yes. Filling? Absolutely. And in an era when every penny counted, chipped beef was a clever way to turn a handful of inexpensive ingredients into a stick-to-your-ribs meal. The taste was salty and rich, the gravy soaking into the toast until it was just the right mix of crunchy and soft. For many families, it was a breakfast staple, though it appeared at lunch or even dinner when times were lean. A jar of dried beef might have cost 50 cents, but stretched across a few meals, it was a budget saver. For kids, it was comfort food, the creamy sauce like a warm hug. For parents, it was practicality served on a plate. And for many who grew up with it, the mere mention today can bring back the memory of a kitchen table, a plate of chipped beef on toast, and the sense that thrift could still taste indulgent. Cabbage casserole. If there was ever a vegetable that defined thrift in the 1950s, it had to be cabbage. Cheap, filling, and available year-round, it was the quiet hero of many family tables. And one of the most beloved ways it showed up was in a simple cabbage casserole. Picture a big, battered Pyrex dish, layered with softened cabbage leaves, rice, a little ground beef if you had it, and tomato sauce poured generously over the top. Sometimes it was baked until bubbly, other times simmered on the stovetop. Either way, when you lifted the lid, the steam carried with it the earthy smell of cabbage mingling with tangy tomato, a fragrance that might not have sounded fancy, but promised pure comfort. This dish was thrifty brilliance in action. Cabbage might have been just a few cents ahead. Rice stretched the meal even further, and the small amount of meat added flavor without breaking the bank. And yet, when it came to the table, it felt like a feast. Families often joked that cabbage stuck with you, and it's true. You could fill up on a helping or two and still have leftovers for the next day. Some kids wrinkled their noses at first, but many grew to love it, especially when mom sprinkled breadcrumbs or cheese on top for a golden crust. Cabbage casserole was more than just a dish. It was proof that humble ingredients could come together to create something hearty, satisfying, and memorable. And in that thrift, there was comfort, warmth, and the quiet reassurance of a full belly. Chicken a la king. Imagine coming home to the smell of something creamy bubbling on the stove, ladled over a slice of toast or a pile of egg noodles. That was chicken a la king. Fancy in name, but really just a smart way to use up every scrap of leftover chicken. In the 1950s, a whole chicken was a prized purchase. Families roasted it for Sunday dinner, then carefully picked every last piece of meat from the bones. The breast might become sandwiches, the legs served cold, but the tiny scraps and shredded pieces, they became the star of dishes like this one. Mixed with peas, pimentos, and mushrooms in a buttery cream sauce, suddenly those leftovers felt elevated. The creamy gravy filled the kitchen with a rich aroma, clinging to noodles or soaking into toast until every bite was hearty and comforting. Kids may not have known they were eating yesterday's scraps, but they knew it tasted good. Chicken a la king proved that thrift didn't mean boring. It could feel indulgent. Served in Pyrex dishes or spooned from the stovetop, it was the kind of recipe that made families feel they were dining in style, even on a shoestring budget. Spam fritters. Few foods carry as much 1950s nostalgia as Spam. Born out of wartime necessity, this canned meat found its way into millions of kitchens. And one of the thriftiest, tastiest ways to serve it, Spam fritters. Mom would slice the pink block of Spam into thick slabs, dip them into a simple flour and egg batter, and drop them into a hot frying pan. The sound of the sizzle was unmistakable, filling the room with the salty, savory scent that lets you know dinner was nearly ready. When they came out, the batter was golden and crispy, while the Spam inside stayed tender and flavorful. At around 50 cents a can, Spam was affordable, shelf-stable, and endlessly adaptable. Pair a fritter with mashed potatoes or coleslaw, and you had a meal that felt substantial without draining the budget. Kids especially loved the crispy edges, and parents loved how easy it was to turn a single can into a whole family dinner. Though some laughed at its humble status, Spam was dependable, and it carried with it the pride of resourcefulness. Even today, the memory of those sizzling fritters can transport you back to a kitchen where thrift and comfort met in the frying pan. Stuffed peppers. Few dishes looked as cheerful on the table as stuffed peppers. Their bright green shells, softened in the oven, held a hidden treasure inside. Rice, a little meat, onion, and tomato sauce all baked together until tender and fragrant. For thrifty 1950s families, stuffed peppers were the perfect trick. A pound of ground beef could be stretched with rice, turning it into enough filling for 4 or 5 peppers. Add tomato sauce, a sprinkle of breadcrumbs, and you had a dish that looked as impressive as economical. The smell of peppers baking with tomato sauce would drift through the house, earthy and savory, making you hungry long before the timer buzzed. And when you cut into one, the soft pepper gave way to a steaming mix of flavors that felt like pure comfort. Stuffed peppers also carried a touch of company meal pride. They were affordable enough for everyday dinners, but fancy-looking enough to bring out when neighbors dropped by. And kids often found it fun to eat food that came in its own little bowl. This dish embodied the spirit of the era, stretching meat without skimping on satisfaction, creating something colorful and filling from just a handful of ingredients. Every bite reminded families that thrift and creativity could go hand in hand. Tuna noodle casserole. If there's one dish that instantly says 1950s family dinner, it has to be tuna noodle casserole. Picture a bubbling Pyrex dish pulled from the oven, steam rising as the crispy topping crackled slightly. Inside was a creamy mix of egg noodles, canned tuna, and cream of mushroom soup, the holy trinity of mid-century budget cooking. The smell was unmistakable. Savory, rich, with that little tang from the mushrooms. The noodles clung together with the sauce, and every spoonful felt hearty and filling. Sometimes Mom sprinkled breadcrumbs on top for crunch. Other times, crushed potato chips added a salty twist that kids adored. Why was it so popular? For one, canned tuna was affordable, about 25 cents a can, and kept well in the pantry. Add a bag of egg noodles and a can of Campbell's soup, and you could feed a whole family for just $1 or $2. It was economical, easy, and comforting all at once. Tuna noodle casserole became more than just a recipe. It was a memory maker. Families gathered around the table, sharing stories while scooping generous helpings onto their plates. It didn't matter if you had it once a week, it always felt special in its own homely way. Potato pancakes. Few things could make a kitchen smell as inviting as potatoes frying in a cast-iron skillet. Potato pancakes, sometimes called latkes or potato patties, were a thrifty way to turn humble spuds into something golden, crispy, and irresistible. Mom or Grandma would grate the potatoes by hand, mixing them with onion, a little flour, and egg. Then came the sound we all remember. The sizzling as spoonfuls of the mixture hit the hot oil, flattening into crisp-edged cakes. The smell was earthy and savory, with just a hint of sweetness from the onions caramelizing in the pan. Served hot with applesauce or sour cream, potato pancakes were simple yet deeply satisfying. A single potato, which might have cost only a few pennies, could be stretched into 2 or 3 hearty cakes. Add a side of homemade applesauce from last fall's canning jars, and you had a meal that felt both thrifty and nourishing. For children, the crispy edges were the best part, sometimes eaten with fingers before they ever hit the plate. For parents, it was the knowledge that something so basic could bring so much joy. Potato pancakes carried with them the heart of 1950s cooking, affordable, filling, and made with love. Ham and bean soup. If ever there was a dish that captured the spirit of thrift, it was ham and bean soup. Families often saved every bit of a holiday ham, and once the meat was gone, the bone was tucked away in the freezer, waiting for its second act. When dropped into a simmering pot of beans, onions, and carrots, that humble bone transformed the whole dish. Slowly, the broth turned rich and smoky, filling the kitchen with an aroma that seemed to hug you from the inside out. By dinner time, the beans were creamy, the vegetables tender, and the soup hearty enough to feed a family for days. This was a recipe of patience and resourcefulness. Beans were cheap, just a few cents a pound, and they stretched the smoky flavor of the ham across meal after meal. Leftovers tasted even better the next day, soaking up more of the savory broth. For many families, ham and bean soup wasn't just about saving money, it was about respect, making sure nothing went to waste. And when you dipped a piece of crusty bread into that steaming bowl, you felt a sense of gratitude, knowing that thrift and tradition had come together in one timeless dish. Jell-O salad. If there's one dish that can instantly transport you back to a 1950s potluck, it's the wiggly, jiggly marvel known as Jell-O salad. Bright, colorful, and a little quirky, these creations weren't just desserts. They were often served right along with the main meal. Picture a glass mold gleaming like a jewel on the dining table, shimmering in lime green or cherry red, dotted with fruit cocktail or canned pineapple rings, suspended like little treasures inside. The sound of a spoon slicing through that gelatin still brings back memories. The gentle wobble, the cool sweetness against your tongue. Sometimes whipped cream or Dream Whip was folded in, giving the salad a creamy pastel look. Other times, shredded carrots or even cottage cheese were mixed in, a combination that sounds strange today but made perfect sense when stretching ingredients was the goal. A box of Jell-O cost only pennies, and with just boiling water and imagination, families could whip up something that looked festive without spending much at all. It became a centerpiece at church suppers, holiday gatherings, and neighborhood picnics. Eye-catching, budget-friendly, and just plain fun. For many kids, Jell-O salad was pure delight. For parents, it was a thrifty way to make a table look abundant. And though recipes varied wildly, the joy was always the same. A dish that reminded everyone thrift could sparkle. Shepherd's pie. Few dishes stretched leftovers as cleverly as shepherd's pie. In the 1950s, it was the go-to solution when you had just a bit of meat left and a fridge full of odds and ends. Imagine scooping into a casserole dish where golden, slightly crispy mashed potatoes gave way to a warm, savory filling of ground beef, carrots, and peas swimming in a rich gravy. The smell as it baked was irresistible, garlicky potatoes mingling with the aroma of simmering beef and vegetables. And visually, it was a showstopper, a perfectly browned crust hiding all the goodness beneath. The beauty of shepherd's pie was its flexibility. Leftover roast beef? Chop it up, and in it goes. A handful of frozen peas or canned carrots? Stir them right in. Potatoes, always cheap and filling, formed the topping, stretching a small amount of protein into a full meal. It was comfort food at its thriftiest best. For families, shepherd's pie felt like a treat, even though it was built from scraps. Kids loved breaking through the potato crust to discover the saucy filling underneath. And parents loved that nothing went to waste. A dish that looked like plenty, even if it started with very little, shepherd's pie was a masterclass in kitchen resourcefulness. Scalloped potatoes. Now, imagine a dish that turned a sack of potatoes and a splash of milk into something rich, golden, and unforgettable. Scalloped potatoes. This casserole was a 1950s staple, and for good reason. Potatoes were cheap, and families often bought them in 25 or 50-pound bags to last the month. Thin slices of potato were layered in a dish with butter, onions, and milk, sometimes enriched with a little flour to thicken the sauce. As it baked, the potatoes softened into tender layers, while the top turned golden and slightly crisp. The smell alone, creamy, buttery, and comforting, was enough to draw everyone to the kitchen. Some families added bits of leftover ham for extra flavor, but even on its own, scalloped potatoes made a hearty side dish that could easily steal the show. Paired with a simple green vegetable or a slice of bread, it became a meal in itself, filling hungry bellies without costing more than a few cents per serving. For kids, it was the kind of dish you piled high on your plate, savoring the creamy texture and crunchy edges. For parents, it was reassurance, proof that even in lean times, a bag of potatoes could feed the whole family with a little creativity. Creamed corn on toast. If you were a child of the 1950s, chances are you remember waking up to the comforting smell of something simmering on the stovetop. Creamed corn on toast was one of those simple yet hearty breakfasts that could turn a quiet morning into a warm memory. Mom would open a can of creamed corn, sweet, golden, and thick, heated in a saucepan with a pat of butter, and maybe a pinch of salt and pepper. Meanwhile, bread toasted under the broiler or in a chrome pop-up toaster, the kind that always seemed to brown one side more than the other. Then came the moment. A ladle full of steaming corn poured over the toast until it soaked through, softening the bread while leaving the crusts just a little chewy. It might not have been fancy, but it was filling. A can of creamed corn cost less than 15 cents, and a loaf of bread maybe 20. For under half a dollar, breakfast for the whole family was ready. The taste was sweet, buttery, and comforting, the kind of meal that stuck with you until lunch. Kids often wrinkled their noses at first, but by the second bite, they were hooked. For parents, it was a sigh of relief. Another meal served, another morning started with full bellies and a little thrift. Oatmeal with raisins. Few breakfasts were as reliable or as thrifty as a steaming pot of oatmeal. In kitchens across the 1950s, you could hear the bubbling sound of rolled oats cooking slowly on the stove, filling the air with a nutty, wholesome aroma. Served in wide bowls, the oatmeal was thick and hearty, often sweetened with a spoonful of sugar, a sprinkle of cinnamon, or the most popular add-in of all, raisins. The raisins plumped as they cooked, releasing their sweetness into the porridge. Some families stirred in a splash of milk or a pat of butter, creating that creamy, comforting texture that made each bite feel like a hug. Oats were cheap, just a few cents a pound, and they went a long way. A single box could feed a family for weeks, making it one of the most budget-friendly staples in the pantry. And yet, despite its simplicity, oatmeal carried with it a sense of tradition. It was the kind of breakfast that grounded you, connecting children of the 1950s with generations before them. For kids, it was sometimes a chore to finish, especially if it cooled too quickly and turned thick and sticky. But on cold mornings, when the kitchen windows fogged from the steam, a warm bowl of oatmeal was exactly what you needed. And looking back, it was thrift and nourishment served in the same bowl. Homemade biscuits and gravy. Few breakfasts could compete with the aroma of fresh biscuits rising in the oven. In the 1950s, homemade biscuits weren't just a weekend treat. They were a thrifty way to stretch a little flour, fat, and milk into something filling and unforgettable. Mom would cut butter or lard into flour with quick, practiced hands, roll out the dough, and cut rounds with a drinking glass. While the biscuits baked, turning golden and flaky, a skillet on the stovetop sizzled with sausage. From the drippings came the magic: milk, flour, and seasoning whisked into a thick, creamy gravy. The sound of the oven door opening, the hiss of gravy bubbling, it all built up to that moment when the biscuits were split open, steaming, and smothered with gravy. The smell was irresistible, the taste rich and savory, the texture a perfect blend of crisp edges and soft centers. It didn't cost much. Flour was pennies a pound, sausage cheap, and milk delivered right to the doorstep. But together, those simple ingredients created a breakfast that felt indulgent. For families, it was a reminder that thrift could still bring comfort and even a little luxury to the table. For kids, biscuits and gravy meant you lingered at breakfast a little longer. For parents, it meant starting the day with reassurance. Bellies were full and the family was cared for. Green bean casserole. No holiday table or even a midweek dinner in the 1950s felt quite complete without the iconic green bean casserole. Imagine a bubbling dish pulled from the oven, the top layer golden with crispy fried onions, while underneath lay tender green beans swimming in creamy mushroom sauce. The recipe was invented in 1955 by Dorcas Riley at Campbell's Test Kitchen, and it quickly became a household classic. A can of cream of mushroom soup, a can of green beans, a splash of milk, and a sprinkle of those crunchy French's onions. Suddenly, you had a dish that looked festive and felt abundant, all for less than $1. The smell as it baked was pure nostalgia. Earthy beans, creamy sauce, and the toasty crunch of onions on top. Kids loved the crispy topping most, often sneaking a few before the dish even made it to the table. Parents loved that it was quick, cheap, and always got eaten without complaint. It was thrifty cooking disguised as celebration. Green bean casserole wasn't just food, it was comfort, pride, and a reminder that even the simplest pantry staples could come together into something memorable. Succotash. If you can hear the word succotash without instantly thinking of Saturday morning cartoons, you might remember it first as a humble, hearty dish on the dinner table. Corn and lima beans, two of the cheapest and most available vegetables, were the backbone of this colorful classic. In the 1950s, succotash showed up at picnics, potlucks, and weeknight dinners. Sweet yellow corn, either fresh from the cob in summer or canned in winter, paired with the mild, buttery bite of lima beans. Add a pat of butter, maybe a dash of salt, and suddenly you had a dish that felt rich despite its simplicity. The colors were cheerful: golden corn, pale green beans, sometimes dotted with red peppers for extra flair. The smell was buttery and sweet, the texture both creamy and tender. Best of all, succotash was inexpensive and nourishing. A bag of frozen lima beans cost around 20 cents, corn even less. For families watching their budget, it was a side dish that fed many without fuss. Succotash carried a sense of tradition, too. It had roots in Native American cooking and had been passed down for generations. By the 1950s, it was a familiar taste of comfort, a reminder that thrift could also be heritage served on a plate. Fried cabbage with noodles. Few smells filled a kitchen quite like cabbage sizzling in butter. Fried cabbage with noodles, sometimes called haluski in Eastern European families, became a 1950s staple because it was hearty, cheap, and delicious. The recipe was simple: shredded cabbage and onions sautéed slowly in a big skillet with butter or bacon drippings, then tossed with egg noodles until everything was coated and steaming. The sizzling sound of the cabbage softening and caramelizing was almost as satisfying as the taste. The aroma was earthy and savory, carrying through the whole house. The noodles added bulk, turning a single head of cabbage, costing maybe 10 cents at the time, into a dish that could feed the whole family. Sometimes a sprinkle of black pepper or a handful of breadcrumbs added just the right touch. For many kids, it was a comfort food disguised as vegetables. For parents, it was reassurance that something inexpensive could stretch into a satisfying dinner. Leftovers reheated beautifully in a frying pan the next day, making it a 2-for-1 meal. This dish also carried with it the memory of heritage kitchens, immigrant families from Europe bringing thrifty, filling recipes to American tables. In the 1950s, fried cabbage with noodles became more than just a way to save money. It was a taste of home, tradition, and the clever magic of turning very little into something wonderful. Rice pudding. There's something magical about how yesterday's leftovers could transform into today's dessert, and rice pudding was the perfect example. In so many 1950s kitchens, when a pot of rice from dinner sat cooling on the counter, it didn't go to waste. It became a creamy, comforting bowl of sweetness. Milk, sugar, and a dash of cinnamon turned plain rice into something that tasted like a treat. The pudding simmered gently on the stove, filling the house with a warm, sweet aroma. Some families added raisins, which plumped up as they cooked, adding little bursts of sweetness in every spoonful. The texture was soft and custardy, the cinnamon swirling through like a cozy blanket. Kids loved it warm, fresh from the pot, while others preferred it chilled, thickened in the fridge. Either way, it was proof that thrift could be indulgent. A cup of leftover rice, a splash of milk, and a spoonful of sugar, together costing just pennies, created a dish that felt like a hug after a long day. Rice pudding wasn't just dessert, it was reassurance, a sweet reminder that nothing in the kitchen ever truly went to waste. Bread pudding. If you grew up in the 1950s, chances are you remember the smell of bread pudding wafting from the oven. It was a dessert born from thrift, using up stale bread that might otherwise have been tossed. But when combined with eggs, milk, sugar, and a handful of spices, that old bread transformed into something golden, fragrant, and utterly delicious. The bread soaked up the custard mixture until it was plump and soft, then baked until the top turned brown and slightly crisp. The smell was heavenly, cinnamon, nutmeg, and vanilla filling the kitchen like a warm embrace. Sometimes raisins or nuts were sprinkled in, adding texture and sweetness. What made bread pudding so beloved was how it felt, both humble and indulgent. It was a dish that reminded families that thrift wasn't about sacrifice. It was about creativity, turning scraps into something that felt special. Served warm, maybe with a drizzle of cream or a dusting of sugar, bread pudding brought comfort to every bite. It was the kind of dessert you lingered over, sharing second helpings while the conversation carried on late into the evening. A true memory maker and proof that simple ingredients can yield unforgettable moments. Applesauce cake. Now here's a dessert that carried the very essence of thrift: applesauce cake. During the 1950s, when sugar and butter could be expensive, thrifty bakers found clever ways to make do. Applesauce added sweetness, moisture, and richness without needing as much fat or sugar. The batter came together quickly: flour, spices like cinnamon and cloves, a scoop of applesauce from last summer's canning jars, and maybe a handful of raisins or nuts if you had them. As it baked, the kitchen filled with the spiced aroma of fall, warm and inviting. The cake was moist and tender, with just enough sweetness to feel indulgent but not heavy. A dusting of powdered sugar on top or a simple glaze made it look elegant, even though it cost just pennies to prepare. Families loved it because it stretched the pantry and satisfied the sweet tooth without breaking the budget. For kids, it was the taste of autumn afternoons and birthday parties. For parents, it was reassurance that thrift and celebration could go hand in hand. Applesauce cake wasn't flashy, but it carried with it the warmth of home, the wisdom of stretching what you had, and the sweetness of simpler times. Homemade chicken pot pie. Few meals felt as comforting or as clever as homemade chicken pot pie. In the 1950s, this dish was often a way to give leftovers a second life. Yesterday's roasted chicken, a handful of vegetables, and some gravy came together under a flaky crust to create something that felt brand new. Picture it: a golden pie pulled from the oven, the crust shimmering with a brushed egg wash, steam curling from the cracks. When the knife slid in, out spilled a creamy filling of tender chicken, carrots, peas, and onions. The smell was rich and savory, wrapping the whole kitchen in warmth. The beauty of chicken pot pie was thrift itself. A single chicken could be stretched across multiple meals, and by the time it made its way into a pot pie, families felt like they were dining on something special. Flour, butter, and milk, the simplest pantry staples, turned into gravy and crust, transforming scraps into abundance. For kids, pot pie was an adventure, breaking into the crust to reveal the treasures beneath. For parents, it was reassurance: nothing wasted, everything used. It was thrift wrapped in golden pastry, proving that resourcefulness could feel like luxury. Goulash. In countless Midwestern kitchens, goulash wasn't just dinner, it was tradition. This simple one-pot wonder stretched a little ground beef into a hearty meal that could feed the whole family. The dish usually began with onions sizzling in a skillet, followed by ground beef browned until fragrant. Then came canned tomato sauce and elbow macaroni, simmered together until the pasta soaked up the flavors. Sometimes a sprinkle of paprika or garlic gave it extra flair, but at its core, goulash was comfort through and through. The smell was tangy and savory, filling the house with the promise of something filling and familiar. The bubbling pot often drew kids to the stove, eager for that first spoonful. And best of all, it made plenty. A single pound of beef, about 40 cents in the 50s, could stretch into enough servings for a large family, with leftovers for the next day. Families loved goulash because it was dependable. It didn't need fancy ingredients, just pantry staples and a little patience. And when served in big bowls with a slice of bread, it became one of those meals that stuck with you long after the last bite. Thrift and satisfaction in one pot. Sloppy Joes. If you remember childhood dinners in the 1950s, chances are a Sloppy Joe made an appearance. Sweet, tangy, and messy in the best way, this sandwich turned simple ground beef into a meal that felt fun. Ground beef browned in a skillet was mixed with ketchup, a little mustard, onion, and sometimes a spoonful of sugar for sweetness. The mixture simmered until thick, then was ladled onto soft hamburger buns. The smell was both sweet and savory, and the sound of sizzling meat made kids hover in the kitchen, waiting for dinner. At about 50 cents for a pound of beef, this recipe was thrifty, stretching meat across multiple sandwiches. And buns, often bought by the dozen, made it easy to serve a crowd. Sloppy Joes were especially popular at school cafeterias and church gatherings, where affordability mattered as much as flavor. The joy was in the mess. Kids loved biting into a sandwich that inevitably dripped onto their plates, and sometimes their shirts. Parents loved how easy it was to whip up on a weeknight. It wasn't elegant, but it didn't need to be. It was hearty, fun, and satisfying. For many, Sloppy Joes taste like childhood summers, backyard dinners, and the comfort of knowing a simple meal could bring a family together. Macaroni and cheese bake. Finally, we come to the ultimate comfort classic, macaroni and cheese bake. In the 1950s, this dish wasn't the boxed version we think of today. It was homemade, baked golden in the oven, and wonderfully thrifty. Elbow macaroni, boiled until tender, was mixed with a creamy cheese sauce made from milk, flour, butter, and just enough shredded cheddar to stretch across the whole dish. Topped with breadcrumbs or extra cheese, it baked until bubbly and browned, the smell filling the house with pure comfort. Cheese was expensive, so frugal cooks learned to use it sparingly, relying on the sauce to make a little go a long way. A pound of pasta cost less than 20 cents, making it the perfect base for stretching. Sometimes ham or tomatoes were added if they were on hand, but even plain, it was satisfying and filling. For kids, it was heaven, the gooey texture, the crispy topping, the familiar cheesy flavor. For parents, it was relief, a budget-friendly meal that always got eaten without complaint. Leftovers reheated well, though they rarely lasted long. Macaroni and cheese bake wasn't just thrifty, it was timeless, a dish that brought families together around a table with smiles, laughter, and second helpings. It closed out the 1950s repertoire with one last reminder: comfort doesn't have to be costly.